Yes, greetings to you all. I'm privileged to be sharing with you this video in which we shall be handling this topic about the church, which has probably startled so many as far as Christianity is concerned. I've titled this sharing "The Church in Context" because I believe there are so many who are perplexed with this same topic. And I pray that God may give me the grace to unlock some of the complexities that are found within it. As we begin, let's have a word of prayer. Mighty Father in heaven, Father, I pray that you may give us the grace that as we study this particular topic, it may be able to be understood in our minds. Open our ears that we may be able to comprehend every detail of it, and that we may find peace at the end of this study. Forgive us for all our iniquities and our sins, which are so many. I pray that you may preserve our lives and you may prepare us, dear Father, for your second coming. Let your will be done is our prayer, living and trusting in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. I for one, have been in Present Truth for some almost now 8 years, and it was not quite easy for us to make up this decision, but I got the privilege that when I went on studying, I have the peace that I have today as far as this topic is concerned. Now, before us is the title, is the GC and the Seventh-day Adventist Church one and the same? I know this is probably one thing that I feel we need to unlock to help us understand clearly the church in its rightful context. Now, here in Uganda, being independent of the General Conference, that is, if you purpose to be self-supporting, to many, it means that you have left the church. And they always tell you, please, brother, you have left the church. You have left the God's church. Now, it also means to many that you are in that state in non-Adventist. So this video intends to make clarification about who is the church and how our pioneers viewed this matter. It is one thing that has troubled, and probably I believe that if we try to unlock it together, to many, they will have a peace of mind because it has totally startled the Christian world today. So, what did our pioneers believe the church to be? Okay, is what we intend to have in this. So it's also intended to prove that the pioneers clearly distinguished between what we call the church, which is the body of Christ, and also the organization that managed her affairs. They clearly distinguished between the two. I believe if you're calm enough and ready to understand, God will be able to open the things to you, and you'll get to know how you ought to behave before the coming of Christ. So we shall also look at the condition of the General Conference over the years and how the prophet, that is Ellen G. White, describes the church that cannot become Babylon. So in this study, we shall try to handle all the things. It's my desire that we try to concentrate because it has so much of reading, and so I pray that you'll be so attentive as we go on with this study. Now, Ellen G. writes to us in early writings, page 124, paragraph 2. She tells us there are different parties of professed Advent believers. First of all, she tries to make it clear that there are so many groups of those that profess to be Adventists, of those that profess, that believe in the second coming of Christ. He says, but of these different Adventist believers, each has a little truth. But God has given all this truth to his children who are being prepared for the day of God. There are, amidst the different categories of professed Advent believers, there is a particular group that God has prepared, that God is giving all the truth which is meant to prepare them for the day of God. He says he has also given them the truth that none of these parties know, neither will they understand. Things which are sealed up to them, the Lord has opened to those who see and are ready to understand. You know, understand the thing requires someone who is so ready to understand. Someone who is meek enough that God may be able, who has a teachable spirit, that God may be able to have the things enter his mind. So if God has any new light to communicate, he has let his chosen and beloved understand it without their going to their minds, without them going to have their minds enlightened by hearing those who are in darkness and also who are in error. So first of all, we get to know that there are many groups that profess this faith. Okay. You know, when John the Baptist lived in this earth, he was perplexed by the Jews and their systems of operation. He realized that there was still this struggle for those who claimed they were they were the ones whom God was meant to use. And so they struggled to be God's people. But God told them through Prophet John the Baptist that it's not by its name that, but by its fruit that the value of a tree is determined. If the fruit is worthless, the name cannot save the tree from destruction. So as we stand today, there are so many who are so attached to this name, Seventh-day Adventists, and they believe that for as long as they are on that, they just believe that for as long as they have that name with them, they're the ones who are destined for salvation. But here we're told it's not about attaching yourself to the name. There has to be corresponding works that qualify you to be called that given name that God chose through those pioneers of ours. So John declared to the Jews that their standing before God was to be decided by their character and life. Profession was worthless. If their life and character were not in harmony with God's law, they were not his people. This is exactly what the message we're preaching all along, that it's not about you claiming that you're Seventh-day Adventist. Your life must be corresponding to what you profess. Okay. So, and Paul writes, speaking of how some of us received the message of salvation, he says that we should not boast against the branches, but if thou boast, thou bearest not the root. You know, what happened to the Jews is that initially God had given them the privilege to be the depository of God's law. And so it was through them that God would bring salvation to the world. But later on, if as they failed to live by the principles that God had given them, God still chose other people to take over this work. And upon this principle, God has always worked in all generations. So here we see that Paul understood this quite well, and he says that, remember that thou wilt say then, the branches were broken off, that I might be grafted in. Well, because of unbelief they were broken off, and thou shouldst stand by faith. Be not high-minded, but fear. For if God spared not the natural branches, if God spared not the Jews, take heed, lest he also spare thee not. So the same thing applies to us today. When God commits before us the work to do, and we fail to stand by those principles, and we fail to live and by those principles, he still calls other people that they may take over the work forward. It's upon this principle that we shall understand how God has always worked throughout many generations. Now, to clearly understand the first question we asked ourselves, we shall need to ask our pioneers what they thought about some of the things, and probably how they obtained that name, Seventh-day Adventists. Of course, it's not a new name, because we also understand that Christ himself, as the spiritual prophecy puts it, was a Seventh-day Adventist. It means he kept the Sabbath. That's one thing that we know about him. Even our first parents, they kept the Sabbath, so which means it was not something new that indeed these people were doing. However, In 1860, we shall do a lot of reading today. In 1860, I've tried to pick some of the pioneer writings so that we can get to know what was in these people's minds as they made these decisions that have made us what we are today. So in this book, Foundation of Seventh Adventists, page 254, paragraph 6, it says, I've tried to paraphrase it, at the 1860 Battle Creek Conference of Sabbatarian Adventists, the decision was made to adopt an official name. James White made the suggestion that the name chosen should be one which would be of least objection and able to the world at large. Okay. Then the name Seventh-day Adventist was proposed as a simple name and one expressive of our faith and position. So in that discussion, they decided to find a name that would be able to unite them all. And this name, which God gave to them, was the name Seventh-day Adventist. So it was proposed, and finally they accepted it. Now, after the discussion, it was adopted that by those present at the conference and recommended to the believers at large. So in general, it was well received, though a few communities opposed it. Ellen G. White viewed it favorably, and this is what she says, as a stunning rebuke to the Protestant world. So meaning that the mere fact, this very name that God had given these people had the very title given to of this name was a stunning rebuke to the Protestant world. And commenting to its missionary significance, she said that the name Seventh-day Adventist carries the true features of our faith in front and will convict the inquiring mind. When you tell someone you're Seventh-day Adventist, people will wonder, what is so special about this? Who are these people? And so imagine you live contrary to what you profess. The world will always watch and see that you claim you're Seventh-day Adventist. This is what you're doing. You know, I've watched most of my my colleagues, and probably I've seen this all along, that even your neighbors, whenever in your neighborhood where you're staying, the very day you think about missing the Sabbath, the very even pray, will say, but you man, how come today you're not going to pray? It is very, very natural, because we are kind of a distinct people. So we need to live a life which is very, very distinct from that of the world. So later on, the name was accepted, and so Ellen G. White says that we are Seventh-day Adventists. Are we ashamed of our name? We answer, no, we are not. It is a name the Lord has given us. So this name is a God-given name. It points out the truth that is to be the test of the churches. The truth embedded in this name is a test to the churches. For as long as you can't stand by those principles, then it means you are going to be affected in that lines. So at all times, we are desired to stand by that, for as long as we are going to be true and faithful to the Lord. So the name Seventh-day Adventist carries the true features of our faith in front and will convict the inquiring mind. Like an arrow from the Lord's quiver, it will wound the transgressors of God's law and will lead to repentance towards God and faith in our Lord Jesus Christ. So as we go through this this study, it's a point we ought to consider at the end of it all, that this is not just any name you can have. God desires you to live by the principles which are embedded in this name. So before 1860, we already had people who were keeping the Sabbath. We had people who had hope in the second coming of Christ. However, by this time, there was a need. There was a need for reorganization of these churches. But in what manner were they going to be? In what manner were they going to reorganize? Because initially, we already saw that we have churches that initially were keeping the Sabbath, and indeed, that is one of the simplest form of organization you can think about. But then, in what were they going to get reorganized in? So here we're told that the principle of uniting individuals into the membership of local churches and then uniting churches to form a group of churches is in accordance with God's divine plan. You have maybe your home setting, a family of maybe 2 or 3 people. That is a simple unit of a church. Now, when this family unites with another family and for the purpose of congregating together and worshiping the Lord and so on, it becomes a local church. Now, this local church later on can also group up with other local churches to form another bigger group of churches. So, this is in accordance with God's plan. And it's upon this plan that individual local churches organize into the General Conference of the Seventh-day Adventists. The Lord in His wisdom has arranged that by means of close relationship that should be maintained by all believers, Christian shall be united to Christian and church to church. We ought to have these connections between us. We ought to have this relationship built up amidst us. And so as these churches, as these local churches get together, as church gets united to another church, this for some reasons which we shall see later on, God approves this. Okay. Now, so in the same view, the pioneers also saw a need for this. So we're told here that as our numbers increased, it was evident that without some form of organization, there would be a great confusion. And the work would not be carried forward successfully. There was a challenge, there was a worry that if we remained in our separate form of churches, it would be a challenge to carry the work forward successfully. And so, to provide for the support of the ministry, for carrying the work into new fields, for protecting both the churches and the ministry from unworthy members, for holding church property, for the publication of the truth through the press, and for many other objects, organization was indispensable. There were some points that were outlined here that indeed we needed to form some form of organization which would be able to help us to support the work of the ministry, for carrying work to new fields, for protecting the churches from unworthy members, for holding church property, publication, and so on and so forth. Now, so we're told that we began with a few individual churches. As the churches increased, however, it became necessary for us to form the conference churches. This is in this book here, BSPC, page 162, paragraph 3. So the few individual churches were already in existence. You can call them, they were individual local churches that were already organized. Now, as the churches increased, however, it became necessary to form conferences of churches. This is now having these local churches bundle up together. As the work still developed, even conferences were organized into unions of conferences. This is amazing. A still further step became necessary as the work took on worldwide proportions, as we desired it to move out to other continents worldwide. And that was the formation of the divisions of the General Conference, which incorporated the unions into divisional organizations. So this is basically how the structure has always been. Work begins in a small area. As you preach in other areas, those churches get together. We form those local churches, and so local churches also form conferences of churches. Conferences of churches also add up with other conferences to form unions of conferences. Later on, the unions of conferences also add up with other unions from other places to form divisions of the conference. This is according to God's word. Now, however, there is something that the pioneers also took note of as they tried to form these conferences. While all Christians in the days of the apostles, this is in the memos of William Miller, he writes about this and says, while all Christians in the days of the apostles were known as Christians, yet if they had had no other distinctive appellations, there would have been as much confusion. Therefore, we find that apostles writing to the churches of Hebrews, writing to the Romans, and again to the Ephesians and Galatians, and etc. If therefore it was right for Paul to speak of the churches of Gentiles, it may not be so very wrong for us to speak of the churches of the Adventists or the churches of the Congregationalists, while at the same time, it would be unscriptural for us to call an association of the churches the Advent Church. If we have an association of churches, it is unscriptural, according to what William Miller writes here, to call it the Advent Church. That is to say, assuming we call the General Conference, which we know is an association of the different individual Seventh-day Adventist churches, it is wrong for us to call the General Conference the Seventh-day Adventist Church. This is unscriptural, according to what Miller writes here. So, as we continue the study, we shall try to prove how indeed this is unscriptural, and probably how the pioneers viewed it as they were choosing, as they were forming that association, which was meant to unite all these churches, and also see how the work can go forward. Okay, so now, in the book Biography to Bio, page 373, paragraph 3, we see that when the pioneers sat down, they saw that the desire to have an organization was not just a mere thought, but it had reached a point whereby it had become a necessity. So Ellen G. writes here and says that in 1873, during the 11th annual meeting of the General Conference, James White first explained why church organization was essential. He said that, "I would say that organization with the Seventh-day Adventists was not entered into as a matter of choice, but it had become a necessity. And now with our organization, however complete, we need wisdom to use it properly. I regard organization more like a fort, to use military terms, in which we may entrench ourselves for protection and self-defense, rather than as a weapon for aggression and warfare." So he continues down and says, to speak more definitely, organization should be regarded by us as the means of uniting our forces and fortifying ourselves against outside influences. We should be careful never to use it in a manner to oppress, in a manner to rule, and also to govern the consciences of honest men. So, in the desire to form this association, which was meant to unite these different local churches and unions and so on and so forth, there was a fear that probably if this association were to be made, remember, what unites these people is basically the faith. But we cannot guarantee that all people will remain faithful. And so because of that, there was a fear that assuming anything of this sort happened, we should know that the reason why we are forming this organization is not for us to oppress, is not for us to rule, and also to govern the conscience of men. The purpose for this organization is to see that we have the work go forward in an organized manner, together with more forces, with the same purpose, and to see that to see how we can hasten the second coming of our Savior. So, in 1860, there was a General Conference session which was conducted, and in this session, discussions were made to see how the decisions would be taken on how they would form this organization, which was meant to unite all these local churches in their different places. So, in 1860, here we shall try to read through the different minutes that were followed, that were written for the record, for purposes of what took place in that given General Conference session. So it says, in 1860, this is Adventist Review and Sabbath Herald, page 161, paragraph 6. You can read through in that periodical. So it says, in 1860, there was a GC session in which delegates from individual local churches attended to discuss matters as pertains the publishing property, which initially was in the name of James White. This is where the whole issue came in from, because we see that James White initially was the individual sole owner of what initially was church property. And as a brother who was so keen, who had a clear eyesight, he saw it that should anything happen, this property is liable to be property for his family, because it was in his own names. So because of that, he thought it necessary that we shall need to form an organization which will help us to hold this property on behalf of the church. And so this is exactly what they have to discuss. So in this meeting, we want to see how did they form this organization, and how did they describe that organization, and which exactly was the church then. So below are the minutes of the meeting and how the pioneers viewed the Seventh-day Adventist Church and the legal organization of the church. So it says, letters from the delegates were called for. A number reported themselves as delegates who had not thought it necessary to bring letters. Brother J.N.O. Clark and H. Crow were delegates by letter from the Lovett's Group Church. We have these brethren who came from this church. Ohio. Brother Butler, also from the church in Gilboa. That was another church. Also Ohio. Now Ohio presented the following. This is what exactly they presented down there. Now we've seen so far members from different churches, local churches, wherever they came from, who came for the purpose of seeing how they would form this organization. Now, we realized that indeed these were delegates with letters of recognition from their various churches, and so they came for the purpose of seeing how they would have this work done in harmony. So it was resolved that we are highly favorable to such organization, and such only as the Bible authorizes and recognizes. We desire to form an organization, but this organization we're forming should be in such a way that the Bible can authorize it and also recognizes it. It should be biblical. Anything out of that, we don't buy it. Now, so Brother White stands up and says, in this same book, I have become satisfied recently, as I have already said, that I am the only legal owner of the publishing property, the only one that could sue or be sued in connection with it. But let me understand that, just as I have always said, that the property that has been donated to the office, brought together by the donations from the brethren and the sisters, I have always regarded as a property of the church in meekness. You would have said, no, these things are not mine, they're mine. But he says, no, these things I regard as a property of the church. So Brother Andrew stands up and says, I came to the conclusion that in order for us as a body, that was after a series of other topics, other suggestions by other brethren, he came up and says, I come to the conclusion that in order for us as a body to hold property, it would be necessary for us to adopt an organization framing our separate churches into one great whole, something after the manner of the Methodist Church. So he says, if we are going to do this, we need to think of something that is going to bring together all our separate churches into one great whole. An example being the Methodist Church, which probably would have done that in that given time. So my idea has been that if we could choose certain brethren, they're now trying to forge a way out how they're going to form this organization. If we could choose some certain brethren, as was done in the days of the apostles, when the seven brethren who were chosen to represent to do other temporal work, to lead the work of the apostles, is basically the principle these guys were trying to follow here. That think of what the apostles did, so that it would be so that it would not be a heavy burden resting upon any one individual. And having these brethren, who we shall choose, constitute an association, okay, something as the trust society holds its property. Let's get these brethren, we give them the trust, let them constitute an association like that of the trust society. This would meet the case. He says that it will relieve Brother White, and that in this case the property will not become individual property as it was initially. For the association could perpetuate itself by choosing in members, and that such an association as this would not be a church incorporated by law, but an association to hold property. So now we're choosing these brethren. They will help us to hold the property. They'll form an association. In this association, we are quite careful that this association would not be a church incorporated by law. It's not a church, but an association to hold church property. So careful. every word is carefully chosen, lest a mistake is made and a problem comes in. So he says, so Brother Cottrell comes in with a suggestion and says, I propose then that a committee be chosen to attend to the financial affairs of the office and to hold property in trust for the purposes specified. It is just as easy to ask the legislature to incorporate a business association as it is to ask them to incorporate a church. And in doing so, we shall make a proper distinction between the church and a legally incorporated business association. So he says we need to really make a distinction between a church and what we're calling this legally incorporated what? Business association. Now, does the legal organization meant to hold property do away with the church? This is the question I put there. So he says, the question was suggested by Brother Cottrell. So he says, suppose that a church that is already organized according to the gospel should reorganize for the purpose of holding property legally. Of course, they will not give up their present organization for another. If this church, which is already organized, is reorganizing for the purpose of holding property, we believe it will not be right for it. It's not biblical for it to give up its present organization for another. This is what he meant. What Brother Cottrell is bringing to our mind is, would the organized SDA church give up its organization so as to be legally recognized? Absolutely not. Why? Because one is a church and another is not. But this is what he says. In his inquiry, he writes and says, which of these organizations is the church? The answer is, I think all must answer the former. So, the former being the local individual churches remain to be the church. Though they join up this organization for the purpose of securing property, doing work, sending workers to worldwide and so on and so forth, what this association remains just an association for the purpose of holding church property, but then the church becomes remains something different. So a question is asked: can one belong to the church and choose not to be part of the organization? Because this is where the whole issue has always been. Because people will say, but no, you're now for you don't want to join, you want to leave the organization. It means you have left the church, because that's exactly what I brought about in the first place. That indeed there are questions. We are always told that when we are not part of the general conference, then we have left the church. And so here is where the question is asked: can one belong to the Seventh-day Adventist Church or belong to the church and choose not to be part of the organization? This is what Brother Cottrell replied. He asked, then can a person belong to the church and not belong to the property or business organization? If all have the liberty to do so, then the business organization is not the church. Very, very carefully chosen words. Then the business organization is not the church, though its members all belong to the church. All its members, all the members of the organization, because actually the choice of those who would be leaders, who would be the representatives in the organization, the members that will be chosen to represent them, the qualification is they had first to be Seventh-day Adventists. They had to be members of the church. So now, this business organization is not the church, though its members all belong to the church, but is a separate association, and there is no necessity for 1/10th part of the church to be members of it. But if the business organization is the church, and none may be members of the church and remain disconnected with it, then I trust it will be seen that the church as an exchange has scriptural organization for that is not scriptural, or at least has given a preference to the latter, making membership to depend on it. Because now, what this man is explaining here is a time has reached whereby, according to what I explained earlier on, that people now look upon being members of the conference as for people to qualify to be in God's church, they need to be members of the conference, which exactly is not according to principle. So this becomes a problem. So which means this is exactly the fear that initially existed, for those guys to have them leave the initial organization which they held and become part of a new organization. So this is exactly what our brother is trying to say here. Now, later on, Brother White writes and says, if such an organization is formed outside of the church, who are to choose the officers? Who is to compose the organization? Okay? Who are then going to be the members who are going to be in charge of this organization? Suppose we are to choose individuals who are to hold the property. Who are to be the voters in the matter? Who are going to be the members that are going to be those who can fit to be the leaders in this organization? Are they to be Sabbath keepers or any that may assemble? I merely inquire for what? For information. So, Brother Paul replied and said, I see no difficulty in appointing officers by a general conference like this. Then White came in later on and said, my difficulty was to decide who they would be amenable to, who could correct them if they were disposed to going wrong. Suppose these brethren who have chosen to be our representatives in this organization that we are forming, any of them go wrong. Who could correct them? Who could decide? Who could tell them, you people now, you've gone wrong. You're meant to leave. Who could turn them out and choose others if they should betray their trust? If we Sabbath keepers could do it, could not other persons come into our assembly and vote us down? Okay, that was a question that Brother White asked about this, because there was no security for any of these brethren, because any of them could still go wrong. None of us is secure about that. So there was a worry for that. So what happened? Brother Andrew stands up and says, if we should select a certain number of these brethren to take up certain affairs in their hands, those brethren would not be amenable to any other body. They would not. Why? If this is an objection, I know not how it can be remedied. There is no way we can remedy this. I do not know as there is any way in which we can provide against apostasy. We have chosen these brethren, but they can choose to betray us. But there's nothing we can do about it. So if these brethren pervert their trust, we are obliged to let them go, but are not obliged to go with them. So it means if these people chose to betray their trust, we're told that we're only to say, let them go. So the organization and its leadership would take their own stand and go wherever they go. And then the church would be obliged to stay and do its work. As to the choosing of officers, I do not apprehend there would be any difficulty. So these people were so careful about this, so they understood all the things quite well. So what happened? So the legal business organization liable to become legal business organization is liable to become corrupted and even fallen, or it is it can be able to leave since the brethren are just held up by trust, by faith. If they choose to go astray, there's nothing we can do about it. So we can say that this organization can become fallen, can become Babylon. When it becomes so, we are obliged to let it alone and work no more with them. So it was resolved that this conference recommend to our individual churches so to organize as to hold their church property or church buildings legally. This was later on what was resolved out of that. Now, here is a simple recap of what really happened and what decisions were taken. I will try to go through them a little fast. It says, it was resolved that 1. The name Seventh-day Adventist be adopted as a simple name and one expressive of our faith and position as our official name. 2. That the Seventh-day Adventists organize legally with the specific purpose of securing unity and efficiency in labor and promoting the general interests of the cause of present truth. Also resolved that we are highly favorable of such organization and such only as the Bible authorizes and recognizes. that we consider it desirable that church property be secured, but having more confidence in that company organized upon the foundations of the apostles, prophets, and Christ. E. That we organize in such a manner as to hold property legally. After looking into the matter, I became satisfied that for us to talk about holding property was one thing, but to talk about holding it legally, quite another thing. F. That in order for us as a body to hold property, it will be necessary for us to adopt an organization framing our separate churches into one great whole. G. That certain brethren be chosen as was done in the days of apostles, so that it would not be a heavy burden resting upon any one individual, and have these brethren constitute an association. That such an association as this would not be a church incorporated by law. It would not be a church. This General Conference Association, or the association to hold maybe in charge of the Review and Herald, a publishing house, will not be a church, but basically would be an association basically meant to hold property. That a petition be made for an act under which all organization of this kind could be formed in the Michigan state. That a committee be chosen to attend to the financial affairs of the office and to hold the property in trust for the purposes specified. That there is a marked distinction between church organization necessary to public worship and the administration of the ordinances of the church, and that organization necessary to hold church property legally. These guys were very careful. They said, no, there is a distinction between the two. That we should fear an organization as a church which has no warrant from the scriptures, so as not to become unlawfully wedded to the earthly governments. That a person can belong to a church, okay, call it a local church, an individual church, and not belong to the property or business organization, because the business organization is not the church, though its members all belong to the church, but it's a separate association. So which means there was room for one to choose to be part of the association. So a local church in an area would choose and say, for us, we don't want to be part of the general conference. We don't desire to be part of that organization. Though we know we may be believing the same things, but for us, we are not convicted to be part of that association. Full stop. And so, being not part of that association will not necessarily mean that they are no longer Adventists. Will not mean that they are no longer part of the church. Will not mean that they are no longer non-Adventists. I mean, they are non-Adventists in that sense, or non-Seventh Adventists. So this is exactly what I've been trying to see how I could explain, so that you can be able to understand what was in the minds of the pioneers as they tried to write out the things. So that since there is no way in which you can provide against apostasy, should these brethren chosen to manage association pervert their trust, we are obliged to let them go, but are not obliged to go with them. So if these brethren betrayed their trust, the church would remain, the association would go its way. That the church is one thing and the society is another. This is not a legal church organization, but a legal business association, to which all can be connected who are interested in the matter. Those who desire to be part of it could join it. Those who didn't want will not join it, and that would have nothing to do with them being non-Adventist or non-members of the church. That this association thus formed can the whole body of the brethren, or as many as choose to enter into it on the condition they are proposed. So it means it was free, my brother, my sister, wherever you are. A church is free to be part of the organization or not to be part of the organization, and that has nothing to do with it having left no longer being part of the church, because it's almost put in a way that the only condition for one to be part of the church is must be in the conference. So this is a clear picture that one could remain self-supporting. A church could desire to be independent, and they continue doing God's work, and they still have raised upon the title Seventh-day Adventists. This is exactly what I've been trying to see how I could explain it in a better way. So, after this organization was formed, there are some irregularities that came on as time went on, and so Ellen G. White had to change some goalposts as far as her view were concerning how this work was done. God having laid down the foundation, having given them the picture or this organization for which they would use to go forward with the work. Later on, some things came in which eventually made the prophet had different views on her understanding about the future of the work. So let's have a look at the state of the GC. So it says, we have seen that our pioneer has made a distinction between the GC and the SDA church. In this section, we shall try to see the changes that took place in the GC and how Ellen G. White viewed it in later years. In 1893, we see that a group of people, this was Brother Stanton and Caldwell, distributed a pamphlet called The Loud Cry, in which they denounced the Seventh-day Adventist as Babylon. Please. So, which prompted Ellen White to write a letter opposing it. So when confronted with this startling question, most professed Adventists will refer to this article to try to show that the General Conference cannot become Babylon, nor will ever reach that point of a corrupt what? Condition. This article is found in Manuscript Readers, Volume 1, page 348 to 357. So we shall see what exactly is brought about here. So in this book, we have these brethren who, I don't know whether they were sure about what they're saying, but I think they could not tell the differences between the two. They wrote this statement and says, those who have published the Loud Cry, Ellen G. White speaking, the Loud Cry tract, have not consulted me upon the subject. They have quoted largely from my writings and put their own construction upon them. They claim to have a special message from God to pronounce the Seventh-day Adventist Church Babylon and proclaim her fall and call the people to come out of her, and try the testimonies and try to make testimonies substitute their theory. So these guys were calling they were preaching this so-called message, the Loud Cry message, and they were claiming that the Seventh-day Adventist Church had become Babylon. Now, I think they didn't understand what they meant by this. So it says, I understand that both these men were at the General Conference in Battle Creek, that is S and C. Could they not discern there the revealings of the Spirit of God? Could they not see that God was opening the windows of heaven and pouring out a blessing? Why was this? She was surprised about what had happened to these brethren. So, it says that the Lord has had a church from that day through all the changing scenes of time to the present period. When anyone is drawing apart from the organized body of God's commandment-keeping people, when he begins to weigh the church in his human scales and begins to pronounce judgment against them, then you may know that God is not leading him. He's on the wrong track. How could they come from that meeting where the power of God was revealed in so marked a manner and proclaim that the loud cry was that the commandment-keeping people were Babylon? Those who were trying to keep the commandments, how could you even say that this part become Babylon? Satan was saying that same thing to Christ when Joshua stood before the angel. So it perplexed her so much and said that no, you can't come up and say the Seventh-day Adventist Church has become Babylon. This is not a message God has given you. It is Satan's devised message. So it was not right for these brethren to preach such a message. So let's get to know, how does Ellen G. White describe the church that cannot become Babylon? He says, let all be careful not to make an outcry against the only people who are fulfilling the description given of the remnant people, who keep the commandments of God and have the faith of Jesus. So the only people who don't qualify to be called Babylon are those who are keeping the commandments of God and have the faith of Jesus, and who are exalting the standard of righteousness in these last days. So those who are exalting, who are trying to raise the standard high of righteousness, and those who have the face of Jesus, These are the people who qualify not to be called Babylon. So, God has a distinct people. In that Testimonies to Ministers, page 58, paragraph 1 says, God has a distinct people, a church on earth, second to none, but superior to all in their facilities, to teach the truth, to vindicate the law of God. God has divinely appointed has divinely appointed agencies, men whom He is leading, who have borne the heat and the burden of the day, who are cooperating with heaven instrumentalists to advance the kingdom of Christ in our world. Let all unite with these chosen agents and be found at last among those who have the patience of the saints, who keep the commandments of God and have the faith of Jesus. These are distinct features that should be found amidst those that God is saying cannot become Babylon. So now, let's see whether Ellen G. White continued to call the General Conference of Seventh Adventist Church God is, whether they still had the voice that was coming from this place was still being led of God, or it had become some other strange voice. So, in 1894, we shall look at the condition as it kept on changing with the years, as we bring it to a conclusion. In 1894, there was a spirit which was being manifested amidst the leadership. He says, God has not laid upon any living man the burden of jealousy regarding the movements of his fellow men, for this would restrict their intelligent freedom. So we saw that there was some bit of controlling power that was being manifested here. He says down here that in following a course of this kind, men are pursuing a similar course to the Roman Catholics, who center in the Pope every power of the Church and ascribe to him authority to act as God, so that those below him in station lay every plan at his feet, that he may prescribe the rules for men and women in every miniature of life. In following a course of this kind, there is a danger that no chance will be left for God to answer the prayers of his delegated servants. For as long as they will begin doing this, and they will continue restricting how the work has to be done, for as long as there will be this kind of kingly power amidst within God's association that is meant to manage God's work, God will stop answering the prayers of his delegated servants according to his promise in giving them wisdom in pursuing their work. He will stop doing that. So he says, if this were to continue in this manner, there is need of a what? Of a protest. You read through that in those pages that clearly indicated. So there was a spirit of domination. This is 1895. Domination. It says the spirit of domination is extending to the presence of our conferences. If a man is a sanguine of his own powers and seeks to exercise dominion over his brethren, feeling that he is invested with authority to make his will the ruling power, the best and only safe course is to remove him. But suppose those guys fail to be removed. If they say, now we're the ones who own the things and we don't want to go away, what are you going to do? Lest great harm be done and to lose his own soul and imperil the souls of others. All you are brethren. So there was this kind of kingly power that was being manifested, and so there was a worry for the cause of God. How about other years? So in 1896, after a series of warnings, Elliot writes and says in Paulson Collections here, page 422, paragraph 8, says, who can now feel sure that they are safe in respecting the voice of the General Conference Association? This is not a Seventh Adventist Church. It says, who is now sure? This is an association for the Seventh Adventists. And so she's very careful to note that this is, these are the leaders within this association. And so it says, who is sure and safe to, who feels safe and sure and safe in respecting the voice of the General Conference Association? If the people in our churches understood the management of the men who walk in the light of the sparks of their own kindling, would they respect their decisions? I answer, no, not for a moment. I have been shown that the people at large do not know that the heart of the work is being diseased and corrupted at Battle Creek. This is where the headquarters was. Many of the people are in a lethargic, listless, apathetic condition and assent to the plans which they do not understand. There were decisions that were being taken here which would affect God's people, but people were just following them because this part made them think that we are the church. The association had become the church. So the decisions we take are the decisions you guys are supposed to follow. We are your leaders. Listen to what we tell you. So the results of this has been in various ways. The sacred character of the cause of God is no longer realized at the center of the work. So there was this degradation, there was this corruption which was taking place within the center of the work. So the voice from Battle Greek, which has been regarded as the authority in counseling how the work should be done, is no longer the voice of God. He says the voice which was meant to counsel the work, which was meant to lead out in how the work should be done, I can't trust it's no longer the voice of God. But it's the voice of whom? From whence does it come, and where is its vital power? The state of things is maintained by men who should have been disconnected with the work long ago. There were men who should have been thrown out from the work of God at that time. But since they refused to be thrown out and they chose to control how the work should be done, it probably means if I were a local church in that time, it would be safe for me to say, I can no longer work with you. With this, I can no longer be part of this association. Let me begin a self-supporting work somewhere and see how the work will go forward. If I had the burden, I would not continue where I would sit and then I'm forced to keep quiet where I ought to be doing the work. But then I am limited because of certain decisions of these big men. Then I would seek where I would do the work comfortably. So these men do not scruple to quote the word of God as their authority, but the God who is leading them is a false God. They even are bold enough to quote the word of God and say, it is God who is leading us. They try to use the scriptures to assure the flock that indeed it's God who is doing what? Who's leading them when he is not leading them? It's another voice that they are listening to. So in 1898, she writes and says, after all those warnings, it has been some years since I've considered the General Conference as the voice of God. It has been so many years that I have regarded the General Conference as the voice of God. Not the Seventh Adventist Church, but the General Conference, which means she was very careful as well as she was speaking these words. In 1899, while she was in Australia, she wrote to the people who were in America at that time, telling them to be careful about what was happening in the US. He says, let those in America who suppose the voice of the General Conference to be the voice of God become one with God before they utter their opinions. Let them be careful. So, if it was no longer the voice of God, it was the voice of who? It was someone else leading them. So it means people had to find, those who had the burden for the work had to find somewhere else that may have their faith grow, that may have a place where they would their faith would be built up in preparation for the second coming of the Lord. So in 1901, Ellen still writes here and says, it is working upon wrong principle that has brought the cause of God in its present embarrassment. The people have lost confidence in those who have the management of the work. People have lost confidence in them. Yet we hear that the voice of the General Conference is the voice of God. Every time I heard this, I have thought it was almost blasphemy. It is blasphemy. The voice of the conference ought to be the voice of God, but it's not. Why? Because some in connection with it are not men of faith and prayer. They are not men of elevated principle. They're those who should have been thrown out from the work sometime back, but because they choose to continue, then it means if you find it not comfortable to sit in that place, find another place where you're going to have more time and freedom to serve the Lord as far as your conscience is clean. So, on a side note, Ellen White's warnings went unheeded by the General Conference structure and leaders, and so she continued to advise them. Apostasy began with the leaders relying upon themselves, and so it went on until finally she had to speak all that voice of all those statements. So in the later on, it says, at times when a small group of men entrusted with the general management of the work have, in the name of the General Conference, sought to carry out unwise plans and to restrict God's work, I have said I can no longer regard the voice of the General Conference, represented by these men, as the voice of God. Of course, if these men choose and agree upon a principle which is not biblical, there's no way you can claim, you can say that it's the voice of God. There's no way. So, if They agree on something. You, the church, sometimes you have to, at all times, you are supposed to stand by that which the Lord has said. If what has been presented by the leaders is totally contrary to what you believe should be the right thing, you're free not to accept it, and you're free to do what God has committed you to do. Though sometimes they may not bear with you staying there, so they may be forced you to leave. And so that's exactly what happens in this kind of setting. So that these men should stand in the second place to be as the voice of God to the people, as we once believed the General Conference to be, that is past. So this is emphasized in General Conference, General Conference, General Conference, which means the General Conference can become Babylon. It can become fallen. It can become corrupted. And so when it becomes corrupted, where does the church stay? The pioneers understood it very well that indeed these two are two different things. We have the church, we have the association. If they choose to betray the trust, let them be. Go ahead and continue doing what God initially had committed you to do. So later on, Ellen G. White wrote what she says would happen to the church in the later years. And this is exactly what she writes down here. She says, as the General Conference went further and further into deep apostasy, Ellen G. Rice was shown what would befall the church in the later times. It says, the enemy of souls has sought to brought in a supposition that a great reformation was to take place among Seventh-day Adventists, and that this reformation would consist in giving up the doctrines which stand as the pillars of our faith and engaging in a process of reorganization. Were this reformation to take place, what would result? If this is what would happen amidst a reorganization would happen amidst the Seventh-day Adventists, what would result? They say the principles of truth that God in His wisdom has given to the remnant church would be discarded. That's number one. How religion would be changed. The fundamental principles that have sustained the work for the last 50 years would be accounted as error. A new organization will be established. Books of a new world order would be written, and a system of intellectual philosophy would be introduced. These are things that have happened to our church. The founders of the system would go into the cities and do a wonderful work. The Sabbath, of course, would be lightly regarded, as also the God who created it. The Sabbath would be lightly regarded. It says, nothing would be allowed to stand in the way of the new movement. The leaders would teach that virtue is better than vice, but God being removed, they would place their dependence on human power, without which God is worthless. Their foundation will be built on sand, and a storm and tempest will sweep away the structure. This is what would happen, and God desires those who see things happen to seek to bring a reformation into God's church. So in 1904, she kept on writing. She says, be not deceived, many will depart from the faith, giving heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of devils. We have now before us the alpha of this danger. The omega will be of a most startling nature. She had fears because she saw at her time already the alpha of the apostasy was already in existence, and she warned about it. So she witnessed the alpha, and so she says what would come later on would be of a more startling nature. So later on, 1905, she also writes and says, we cannot now step off the foundation God has established. We cannot now enter into a new organization, for this would mean apostasy from the truth. But this is where the leadership under the conference were taking the church. So till finally she warned them and told them that it's no longer safe for you to keep your children in battle grid. Call them away without delay. Satan has come down with great power to work with all his abilities of unrighteousness and to cause God's people to live the truth. So as we have read, she also wrote some time back concerning the danger of the General Conference becoming a state Babylon. She says, we must, as a people, arouse and cleanse the camp of Israel. Lasciviousness, unlawful intimacy, and unholy practices are coming in among us in large degree, and ministers who are handling sacred things are guilty of sin in this respect. they are coveting their neighbors' wives, and the seventh commandment is broken. We're in danger of becoming a sister to Babylon, of allowing our churches to become corrupted and filled with every false spirit and a cage of every hateful and unclean bird. And we are, and we be, and will we be clear unless we make decided movements to cure the existing evil? So the General Conference was soon becoming a sister to Babylon. It was following in the steps of the fallen Babylon system. So then she finally writes and says, after all the things that taken place, she writes and says, the religion of Jesus is indeed endangered. It's being mingled with worldliness, while the policy is taking the place of the true piety and wisdom that comes from above. And God will remove his prospering hand from the conference. So he says, after all the things, God would not continue working with such men. So he would remove his prospering hand from the conference. Why? Shall the ark of the covenant be removed from the people? It means God's word was no longer being given to the people. Shall idols be smuggled in? Shall false principles and teachings be brought into the sanctuary? Shall Antichrist be respected? Shall the doctrines and principles given by God, which have made us what we are, be ignored? Shall God's instrumentality, the publishing house, become a mere political world institution? This is directly where the enemy, through blinded and consecrated leaders or men, is leading the church. So, how do we know that indeed the Antichrist is being respected? We read in one of these. This was Neil C. Wilson, who was once the father to Ted Wilson. In one of the meetings, conference president verbalized the conference position regarding the papacy. This is one of his statements. He says, although it is true that there was a period in the life of the Seventh-day Adventist Church when the denomination took a distinctly anti-Roman Catholic viewpoint, that this attitude on the church's part was nothing more than a manifestation of widespread anti-popery among conservative Protestant denominations in the early part of the century. He says this was totally a view that was presented by those who were anti-popery. But I thought we have always been against the principles that are portrayed by the papacy. So this simply shows that there was room for compromise in this matter. So under the World Council of Churches, the Religious Council of Churches, you're not supposed to speak anything ill about any other denomination. So because of this, the former president Neil C. Wilson, the father to Teddy Wilson, had to speak such things, which was totally contrary to what our view. So in this context, we can say that in these, shall Antichrist be respected? This is indeed what exactly they were trying to do. They respected them. Instead of pointing out the errors that have been done, instead of showing to the world that indeed this is the whole issue, this is where the problem is. Now it was time for him to say, this is totally, we don't believe in that. We don't believe in preaching anti-popery messages, because he says all that was later on thrown into the trash pit. They were all thrown away because it's not the message that Adventists are supposed to preach, which is totally wrong, because we are supposed to speak out all these evils, and people should know about them. Okay, in another session, this was there was a live panel discussion in this date. In this discussion, prominent leaders from the General Conference participated. These leaders discussed Revelation 14, which is the three angels' messages, and Elder Chadushan, who was then the president of the Worldwide General Conference Association, stood up and was asked a question: what is the mark of the beast? This is what he replied. He says, and in fact, the mark of the beast would be the worship of God on any other day other than that particular day, because that is the sign of God's authority. We don't preach such messages. He says the mark of the beast would be the worship of God on any other day other than the particular day, because it's a sign of God's authority. This is not what we preach, because Ellen G. White says that the mark of the beast, she's quite specific that it would be when National Sunday, when the National Sunday is basically made a day of worship by law, so it's not, does not speak of any other day. It speaks of Sunday specifically. So it means this is not our view. So if our leader would present such a view, then it means he's also trying to compromise in that kind of manner. So these principles, or I wonder whether he has read the spirit of prophecy, because to speak of to describe the mark of the beast in such a sense is totally contrary to what the spirit of prophecy says. It speaks specifically of Sunday worship, not any other day. It's exactly what our leader at the time spoke. So, shall the given testimonies be rejected? Because this is exactly what happened. Way back in 2005, there was a resolution concerning the spirit of prophecy by Ellen G. White, and in this resolution, some of these decisions were taken. One of them was they said that Ellen G. White's writings will constantly lead the church back to the Bible as the very foundation of faith and practice. This is very true. But later on it says, they also added that the gift exercised by Ellen G. White can enrich the church but not define our faith and practice. This is totally speaking two things, opposite things with the same mouth, because you can't say it can enrich but again not define our faith, which means literally her writings are of no use to the church. If they can't enrich our faith, if they can't define our faith, then it means what value then is believing them? So that's the reason why these people can quote even they find it even easy to quote some of the scriptures, and they make everything of non-effect. So this is what these guys did. They chose to throw away Ellen G. White and say that her writings cannot define our faith, so which means it's not worth considering her writings. So, finally, the state of the General Conference today also told that, shall the Sabbath be violated in our churches? This is also what has been done. So, not that the Sabbath commandment shall be broken, but it has constantly been violated and broken. How has this been done? There has always been buying and selling of lesson quarterlies, hymn books on the Sabbath. These things, we have seen them happen in most of our local churches here. Employment of non-believers on the Sabbath, those who come and cook food for us on the Sabbath. I've seen it in some of our big churches here, because people forget that we have a preparation day when the things are supposed to be done. But these guys are brought and they are paid on the Sabbath, holding meetings on the Sabbath. According to 60, it tries to give us some of the things we're supposed to do and which things we're not supposed to do on the Sabbath. But the things are always conducted in most of our local churches here. Cooking food on the Sabbath, among others, have been sanctioned by pastors and elders. They always try to give you reasons to justify that the things that they are doing are worth doing. They will always tell you it is for saving life. And there are those good words they use to make it appear that what exactly is happening is the right thing. But this, as we continue doing this is basically a sign that indeed these systems have fallen, and God is calling upon those who are ready to take a stand, who are ready to take the message forward, to go out in what we call the irregular lines, which we call the independent ministries, and start up a work and prepare people for the second coming of Christ before it is too late. So this is what we had to cover up in this section. It's my prayer that God may guide you as you make up your decisions as pertains the work, that you may clearly know that there's a distinction between the General Conference Association and also the Seventh Adventist Church. So that does not necessarily mean that if you're not part of the General Conference, you are non-Adventist. You remain a Seventh Adventist for as long as you stand upon those principles, which are basically meant to be a test to all those who profess to keep the Sabbath and also believe in the second coming of Christ. So being independent from the General Conference does not mean that you'll have left the church. No. You are the church itself. So we are Seventh Adventists. Though separate from the conference, we are independent ministries that believe in the second coming of Christ and also believe in the Sabbath of the Lord. And we're preparing a people that will stand when our high priest says it is finished. So we're preparing a people that will finish up the work which is to be proclaimed in these last days. So it's my prayer that you make up your decision. No one should confuse you that you've become something different. No, no, no. Believe what I'm telling you. The scriptures and the pioneers understood it clearly that these two things are different and are clearly different in all possible ways. May God bless you as we prepare to meet up next time in the next study, where we shall be looking at the separation message. We shall look at the separation message. May God bless you. Till then, thank you for watching. Bye bye.